Chapter 9. Broken. Anton choked on water. He couldn't breathe. His head was submerged in a bucket of water. Hands held him down. One gripped the back of his neck like a pair of pincers. The other had a fistful of his hair. Anton struggled. He fought to live, even though all rational thought said he should just give up. Let the bucket of water carry him into oblivion. He held his breath as long as he could, bucking and struggling against the hands that held him. He kept his lips clamped shut, willing himself not to breathe. His body overpowered him. Instinct shoved aside will. He inhaled without meaning to. Water gushed down his nose and throat. He fought harder against his captor, but the fuckhead had the advantage of leverage. The soldier gripped Anton's hair with such ferocity, Anton half expected his scalp to be torn away. Just when he thought it was over, just when he thought he would drown in a bucket of water like a rat, he was yanked up. The soldier flung him roughly across the cell. His skin tore against the concrete floor. Anton rolled onto his side, coughing up water. He was still hacking when cigarette embers scorched his shoulder. He couldn't help it. Even though he'd been determined not to cry out, the combination of not being able to breathe and the pain of the embers tore it from his throat. He collapsed to the ground, still choking on the water that filled his lungs. Laughter rang out above him. The KGB agent leered down at him through the curling ends of his mustache. Off to one side stood his soldier lackey, whose sleeves were drenched from holding Anton's head in the bucket. Through a haze of fear, Anton noticed the lackey had grayish bruises on his face and hands. He looked like he'd gotten the shit kicked out of him. Good. The fucker deserved every punch. How many times had he been nearly drowned today? How many times had he been burned by a cigarette? 12? 20? He'd lost count of both. There was a second soldier in the room today. At a nod from the agent, the second soldier pulled Tate's head out of a bucket of water. Tate landed next to Anton on the floor, coughing and hacking. His shaggy hair was plastered to his face. Tate wasn't treated to another cigarette burn, but he did get half a dozen kicks in the ribs from the Soviet fucker who had the pleasure of nearly drowning him. "You can put a stop to this any time." The KGB agent knelt in front of them, puffing away at his fucking cigarette. "Just tell me where the sniper base is. I can make all this pain stop with the snap of my fingers." Anton wanted nothing more than to grab that cigarette and burn out the man's eyeballs. He was too busy coughing to come up with a witty retort. Tate didn't have the same problem. "Fuck you, you Soviet fuck! Rot in hell with you zombies!" The agent shrugged, taking another long drag. Anton's first stable breath was tainted by the nicotine smoke. "Suit yourself." The agent flicked his hand at the two soldiers. Both lackeys looked like they'd gotten in fistfights, their faces and hands covered with grayish bruises. Hell, maybe they'd beat the shit out of each other. Anton was hauled up by his hair and dragged back to the bucket. Dread shot through his limbs. He fought hard, swinging his fists at his captor's stomach. He got a boot in the crotch for his efforts. As he gagged on the agony, his head was shoved back into the bucket. Water flooded his body. He bucked against the pain in his crotch, even as he fought the water filling his lungs. Darkness ringed the edge of his vision. Was this it? Was he going to die? His body twitched. His chest seized. He was dying. Anton knew it as surely as he knew his shoe size. He was hauled out of the bucket. Barely conscious, he was thrown back to the floor. When a boot laid into his ribs, he could do nothing more than choke up water. The agent strolled over to Anton. To the lackeys he said, "They all break. You just need to know how to apply the right pressure." He punched Anton in the stomach. When Anton cried out in response, he did it again and again. Anton flopped over onto his back. The agent knelt on top of him, pressing a knee into his solar plexus. He twirled a knife between his fingers, smiling down at Anton in cold anticipation. "You love the uniform of Mother Russia so much," the agent purred. "Let's make it permanent." He pressed the knife into his flesh, slicing the blade against his upper left chest. Anton smelled the tang of his own blood. He bucked, bellowing, but the agent ground his knee harder into him. The agent hummed as he worked, puffing on his cigarette as he carved into Anton's skin. What the fuck was he doing? Trying to turn him into a Picasso? "What the fuck?" Anton screamed. "What the fuck?" "You know what I want," the agent purred. "You'd better hurry up before I finish. I'm not sure you'll like my picture." Anton craned his neck. It took him a moment to make sense of what he was seeing through all the blood. Then he saw it, the distinct star and the curve of the sickle. With a smile, the agent pressed the knife into him as he began to draw the line of the Soviet hammer into his skin. It was worse than everything else he'd endured so far. What were 24 cigarette burns compared to being vandalized? He didn't have to fake the bulging of his eyes or the frantic thrash of his body. This was it. He had to send these fuckers on a wild goose chase. If he waited any longer, they would kill him. Of that he had no doubt. As it was, he would wear the symbol of Mother Russia for the rest of his short life. Anton wanted to go out on his terms. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing they would never, ever find his family. If he had to die, it would be by his choosing. It wasn't hard to start crying. He hurt so badly, the tears flowed easily. He gave himself over to the show. Sobs racked his body as he sagged onto the stinking floor. He was pretty sure his head was in the damp remains of his urine. Did he look appropriately broken? He felt broken, at least in his body. Clinging to the mental images of his family kept him strong inside. He had to make these fuckers believe. They had to see a boy truly wrecked. "Stop!" Anton screamed. "Stop it! I'll tell you! God damn it, I'll tell you!" Tate played his part to a T. "Don't do it, Anton! Don't you dare!" A soldier grabbed Tate by the hair and hauled him back to the bucket. His protests were lost in a splash of water. "Talk!" A new cigarette dangled from the agent's mouth. Anton talked. His words came out weak and blubbery. It wasn't an act. "There's an old cement cistern at the dam. That's where they are." A plume of smoke hit him in the face. Anton was too weak to cough. It stung his bleary eyes. He tamped down the glare that tried to rise. Broken. He had to look broken in both body and spirit. It was the only way to sell their story. "The dam, you say?" "Yes." Anton tried to nod, but his body hurt too much. The KGB fuckhead remained crouched on top of him, sucking on his cigarette as he studied Anton. "Young man, I think you may be telling the truth. A shudder ran through Anton's body. This was it. He was going to be executed. The knowledge dried his tears. He may go out beaten within an inch of his life, but he wasn't going to go out like a blubbering coward. He may not want to die, but he was ready for death. It was a welcome trade for the lives of Lena, Nona, Leo, and Dal. He'd make the trade 1,000 times. Yes, I do think you might be telling the truth. The agent rose to his feet. But we will make sure. If you're telling the truth, we will give you a fast death. A humorless smile curled the corners of his mouth. If you lied to us, we will hurt you in ways you never thought possible. With this new threat issued, the agent and Soviet lackeys left the cell. Anton felt like he'd been kicked in the face yet again. He was still alive, he and Tate, and within a few hours, the Soviets would know he'd sold them a sack of bullshit. Limp on the floor, he realized just how badly things had gone. Tate lay beside him, panting for breath from his last round with the bucket. No words passed between them. As Anton met his friend's gaze, he saw his own dread reflected back at him. All their ruse had bought them was a few hours of fitful sleep on the stinky floor of their dungeon. Anton was cold, hungry, thirsty, and aching in places on his body he'd never known existed. But worse than all that was the knowledge of how badly he'd miscalculated the KGB agent. He thought he and Tate had been driving the bus. They'd been idiots. Anton would never give up his family. He was destined to die slowly and painfully. He'd tried to circumvent his fate, but it was coming back to get him. He made a silent promise. He would endure. The Soviets would not break him. I'll surprise them, Mom. I won't give them a fucking thing. He would die, but his family would live. It would have to be enough. Chapter 10. Family. Someone shoved a bowl of water and several slices of bread through a slot in the bottom of the door. He and Tate had been left untied after their countless near drownings. They crawled across the floor to reach it. They inhaled the dry slices of bread and sucked water from the bowl like dogs. The Soviets had well and truly reduced them to animals. After that, there was nothing to do but wait for the other shoe to drop. He and Tate were too weak to speak, but Anton didn't miss the way the other boy looked at the bloody carving on his chest. It made Anton sick. He turned his back on Tate and curled up on his side. Anton drifted in and out of sleep. In a half-lucid state, childhood memories surfaced in rapid succession. He clung to them, holding those stupidly blissful moments the way an archaeologist might hold a jewel box recovered at a dig site. There had been all the times he, Leo, and Dal had spent on their dirt bikes, riding around the cabin until they were delirious with hunger. Nona and their mother always had hot meals waiting for them when, sweaty and filthy, they returned home. "No gorillas at the Chiquino table," Nona liked to say. She practically made them strip on the porch before permitting them to trek through the house. Once the boys washed up, she always fed them like they might starve to death. Meatballs, spaghetti pomodoro, gnocchi with cream sauce, minestrone soup. God, what he wouldn't give for a bowl of her food right now. He was so goddamn hungry. His mind flashed back to the age of 7 when he caught chicken pox. His mother had quarantined him in the room he shared with Leo, forbidding everyone except herself from going inside. Lena had disobeyed their mother and snuck in with a bowl of Campbell's chicken soup. She'd been desperate to check on Anton and ended up getting chicken pox along with him. Being quarantined in a room with his twin sister hadn't been so bad. They'd played I Spy and Uno and thrown spitballs at each other for days. It had been a good way to pass the time. Thinking of Lena took him back to a time when the whole family had been out in the apple orchard. He couldn't even remember how old they were. One of Nona's grumpy old billy goats had rammed Lena in the butt and knocked her over. Only Anton and Dal had been around. Dal had walloped that poor goat with righteous vengeance. Anton secretly felt sorry for the goat. Sure, the animal had been obnoxious, but he hadn't deserved the full force of Dal's rage. Anton hadn't been brave enough to defend the goat. Instead, he'd fetched the hose from behind the barn. When Lena had turned her back, Anton unleashed a stream of cold water on her. Anton hadn't thought about that in years. It occurred to him that Dal may have been in love with his sister since they were kids. No wonder they'd ended up together. Anton never told anyone why he'd sprayed Lena. In the water fight that ensued, no one had thought to ask. Even Nona had partaken in the fun, grabbing a hose from around the back of the house to spray Anton and his siblings. He still remembered the way the water had smelled on the dry soil of the orchard. He remembered what it felt like when he stepped on a rotting apple and it squished between his toes. He remembered the sound of his mother's laughter when their father dumped a bucket of water over her head. As he surfaced in and out of pain-hazed sleep, Anton replayed this memory over and over and over. He thought it might be the singular best day in his entire life. And he hadn't even known it until now. The KGB agent returned several hours later. One look at his thunderous expression said it all. Anton and Tate were well and truly fucked. Everything they had endured up until this point had been kitten's play. He couldn't stop the shudder that ran through his body. He'd never been so fucking scared in his entire life. Then again, he'd never been this resolved either. He was determined to hold. He'd be a fucking fortress. No matter what they threw at him, his walls would hold. "Sniper scum," the KGB agent snarled. He kicked Anton in the ribs. "I suspected the lie when I looked in your eyes. Too bad for you. There is no fast death for you now." He turned to his lackeys and spat out a string of Russian. One soldier grabbed Anton by the hair, hauling him toward the open cell door. Anton scrambled to get his feet beneath him, if only to keep the Soviet from ripping his hair out by the roots. He and Tate were dragged down the hall, which was lined with other cell doors. The KGB strolled along behind them, his head wreathed in a cloud of cigarette smoke. The boys were flung into a new cell. It was larger than their previous one. Based on the bunk beds, it looked like it had been built to hold 4 prisoners. The cell wasn't empty. There were 2 other Soviet soldiers in the cell. Both had grayish bruises all over their faces, just like the 2 with Anton and Tate. Anton barely noticed. All his attention fixated on the prisoners in the cell with them. Tied to 2 chairs, looking as fucked up as Anton felt, were Mr. and Mrs. Craig. Even though he'd been pretty sure they were prisoners, seeing them was still a shock. They'd been stripped of shoes and shirts, just like Anton and Tate. Beholding Mrs. Craig's bare, saggy breasts wasn't the worst of it. The two of them looked like they'd been subjected to the same grisly shit that Anton and Tate had endured. The sight of them turned Anton's insides to mush. In that moment, he would have gladly taken all their suffering on himself. He would have done anything to spare them the torture they'd endured. Tears pricked his eyes, but he blinked them back. The four of them stared at each other. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Their eyes said it all. The KGB agent observed them.
"You know each other. It is as I suspected. You are all snipers."
No one said anything. Anton didn't have the strength to deny it. Besides, what good would that do? The Soviets were going to grind them to blood and entrails no matter what they said.
"Tell me what I want to know."
The agent flicked his fingers at Anton and Tate. The soldiers loomed up before them. Anton braced himself as the first blow fell. He endured. It was all he could do. He locked on to the mental image of Nona, Lena, Leo, and Dal, clinging to them with the sanity he had left. Blows rained down. His head, his back, his crotch, his ribs, his face, his stomach, everywhere. There was no part of his body that was spared. But even worse than the blows was the sound of Mrs. Craig's crying. It was like a file to his bones. It was the first time since he'd been captured that he began to pray for spontaneous death. The blows stopped. Anton struggled to catch his breath. His vision blurred. He lay on the floor, limp and panting. "Mom," he silently called to her, summoning the image of what she had looked like in the weeks before she had died. The cancer had eaten her up from the inside, reducing her to skin and bones. But she had never given up to the disease. She told Anton and his siblings every day that she loved them. She spent her waking hours combing through newspapers and studying everything she could find on the Soviets, one of her favorite pastimes. Dad used to joke that she had missed her calling as an investigative reporter. She had a smile for each of them every day. Even in the face of death, she had been strong. "Mom, help me." He clung to his memory of her. Mom's body had folded under the weight of the cancer, but her spirit had stayed strong. He remembered the last thing she had said to him before she died. "You will do great things in this world, Antony. I feel it in my bones. I love you, my son." Do great things. Holding out under the battering of the Russians felt like the singular greatest feat of his life. He would do it. He would hold out for Mom. The world swam back into view. He became aware of two soldiers standing beside the Craigs. One had a gun pressed to the side of Mrs. Craig's head. The second one held a gun against Mr. Craig. Against the backdrop of this horror, Anton noticed something. The eyes of the soldiers looked red. Was it a trick of the light? Or had he been kicked in the head one too many times? One of them even looked like he might be getting sick. The front of his uniform was stained with sweat. Or maybe he had just overexerted himself beating the shit out of them.
"I grow weary of this game."
The KGB agent stood over Anton and Tate, puffing like a chimney on his cigarette.
"You have until the count of 10 to tell me what I want to know. Refuse to answer me, and I'll kill your friends."
Tate's eyes bugged. His gaze shot between Anton and his parents. "We're ready to die." Mr. Craig's voice was pinched with pain, but his words were firm. One of the soldiers smacked him hard in the back of the head.
"One?"
The embers ignited in the end of the agent's cigarette. 2? Anton stared wildly at the Craigs. This was an impossible choice. He was being forced to choose between his family and the Craigs. It wasn't right.
3.
Mr. Craig met his gaze and gave Anton the tiniest shake of the head. The message was clear. He wanted them to hold out, to stay silent, even if it meant his death. Anton shot a quick look at Tate. His friend looked on the verge of being sick.
4.
"Long live America!" Mrs. Craig burst out, tears streaming down her eyes. She cried out when she received a hard blow from her captor.
5.
"Stop!" A sob tore free of Tate's chest. "Stop!" "No!" Mr. Craig yelled. He received another vicious blow to the head. His captor looked sicker by the second, but that didn't stop him from smiling when Mr. Craig sagged under the blow. "I'll tell you," Tate said. "I'll tell you what you want to know. Just let them go, please." The KGB agent came to stand over Tate, lighting yet another cigarette. How many of these things did this fucker go through in a day? "Let them go back to the farm," Tate pleaded. "Just let them go and I'll tell you everything." He wasn't bluffing. He meant every word. His friend was about to sell out the Cecchino family. "No!" Anton tried to lunge across the floor. He didn't have a plan. All he knew was that he needed to stop Tate from talking. He didn't make it far. A soldier interceded, kicking Anton up against the wall. Tate flicked a single look at Anton. It was all Anton needed to see. Tate was being forced to choose between his family or Anton's. He had chosen his family. Part of Anton didn't blame him. The other part of him wanted to kill Tate, to stop him before he could sentence Lena, Dal, Leo, Nona, and everyone else to death. He didn't move. The Soviet had him pinned to the wall, his boot pressed against his stomach and making it hard for him to breathe. "Tate, don't do it," his mother pleaded. "Don't." Her chair was kicked over. She fell to the ground with a cry. "Let them go back to the farm," Tate said again.
"Fine."
The agent puffed away on his cigarette.
"They are of use on their farm. My men like their milk. Tell me what I want to know, and I will have them taken back to their farm."
"Tate! No!" Anton screamed. "Don't do it!" Tate rattled off the address of the Cecchino farm. Mr. Craig made a desperate lunge, trying to fling himself at his son. A bullet from the agent took him in the side of the head. He was dead before he hit the ground. Mrs. Craig let out a terrible wail of grief. The KGB agent turned neatly on his heel and shot her in the head. He spun back around to Tate, a cruel expression on his face. Tate was howling, incoherent grief tearing from his throat as two Soviets pinned him.
"I always know when a man is lying to me,"
the agent said to Anton.
"That young man isn't lying."
With that, he shot Tate in the head. Shock reverberated through Anton's body. He couldn't move, couldn't do anything beyond stare at the dead bodies of his friends. The agent leveled his gun at Anton. He barely noticed. He couldn't peel his eyes from the Craigs. They were gone, their entire family gone. Just like that. A strange sound rippled through the prison cell. At first, Anton didn't even register it. He was still caged in the vibrato of his own shock, feeling the pressure of loss gathering in his core. Someone moved. A soldier. He fell on top of Tate, dipping a hand into the ruined cavity of his friend's head. His eyes had gone completely red. While everyone else in the cell looked on, he took a long, slow slurp of brain. It was almost exactly what had happened to Jim when he died, except the fucker eating Tate's brain wasn't a mutant zombie. He was a Russian, a fully sentient Russian. The KGB agent let out a long string of words, shouting at the soldier. The soldier ignored him, slurping on the brains. His eyes grew redder by the second. He didn't stop, not even under the command of the KGB agent. What the fuck was happening? Chapter 11. Alarm. A second soldier closed in on Mrs. Craig's body. It looked like he was going to drag her from the room. But he didn't. Nostrils flaring, he fell over her shattered skull and buried his face in the brain matter. A disgusting slurping sound rose from the gore, overlaid by a rumble of contentment that came from the man's chest. The shouting of the KGB agent grew in intensity. The other two soldiers in the room had fallen back, staring in horror at their comrades. Anton struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. There was only one reason people ate brains. They were infected with the Nezhet virus. Something had happened to these soldiers. Somehow, they'd been infected. They might not look like mutants or regular zombies, but even in his current state, Anton knew he was seeing some twisted fallout of the Nezhet virus. Never ceasing his string of commands, or his puffing on his cigarette, the KGB agent shifted the barrel of his gun, aiming it at his lackeys. The threat was clear in his voice. The soldier feeding on Mrs. Craig ignored him. The one feeding on Tate looked up and bared his teeth. Anton registered the man's bunching muscles. So did the KGB agent. Right as his soldier sprang for him, he fired. 3 bullets hit the man in the face. He fell lifeless to the ground right in front of Anton. The agent didn't waste any more breath on orders. He rotated on his heel and shot the other feeding soldier with the same cold efficiency, emptying several bullets into his head. The remaining 2 soldiers stood petrified against the wall. The agent turned his wrath on them, shouting. Anton caught a single name in the string of what was otherwise gibberish. Dr. Kozlovovich. Under the agent's fury, the terrified soldiers grabbed the bodies of their murdered comrades and dragged them out of the cell. Anton heard the agent scream the name of Dr. Kozlovovich several times. Soon, the cell had emptied of soldiers. It was just Anton, the agent, and the bodies of his 3 dead friends. The dark eyes of the KGB agent landed on him. He leveled the barrel of his pistol at Anton's face. Anton's heart seized in his chest. He forced himself to meet the cold stare of his torturer. He would not give this fucker the satisfaction of seeing him cower. If he had to die, he would do it with a straight spine. Slowly, painfully, he dragged his body upright. He crouched on his knees before the agent, staring up at him with defiance. He reached into the recesses of his life before the invasion and pulled up his best expression of cocky derision, the one he'd often served to Leo at breakfast. "I always knew you'd be the hardest one to break," the agent said. "Too bad our time is up. I would have enjoyed breaking you." The rest of his words were drowned out as a wailing siren broke out. The lights in the hallway flared on and off in time with the siren. The agent swore in fluent English, never taking his eyes off Anton. He raised his voice so it could be heard over the wail of the siren.
Unfortunately, I have circumstances to deal with. I have no more time for breaking American dogs. Rest in hell, little sniper.
Anton never took his eyes off the agent. In his mind, he clung to the memory of the water fight with his family. The KGB agent pulled the trigger. The gun clicked empty. Time froze. The only things that existed were Anton, the KGB agent, and the empty gun that hung between them. Anton knew an opening when he saw one. He tensed, about to spring. The agent preempted him with a vicious blow to the head. Anton staggered under the attack, dimly aware of the cell door slamming shut.
"I'll be back for you, little sniper."
He barely heard the words over the wail of the siren. The prison cell lurched around him. Anton sagged against the wall, trying to get his bearings. The fucking siren made his head feel like it was going to implode. Or maybe it was just the aftershock of the pistol whip. The siren abruptly shut off. Anton's ears rang. But it was more than that. Over the ringing in his ears were strange sounds. He struggled to make it out. It sounded like screaming, lots of it, and gunfire. He closed his eyes, listening. Yes, there was definitely shouting. It was coming from outside the jail. Something was going on. His eyes fell on the body of Tate. His gaze panned wide, also taking in the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Craig. He was stuck in a cell, surrounded by the bodies of 3 dead friends. The chaos outside the jail faded to a distant buzz. All Anton could hear was the pounding of his heart and the rasping of his breath. Emotion bunched in his throat, demanding release. He fell forward, forehead resting on Tate's bare, bloody shoulder. A sob broke from his throat. His chest heaved as he cried. The entire Craig family was gone, wiped from the earth by the Russian scum. His mind kept looping on the moment when Tate gave up the address to the Chiquino farm. There had been nothing but blind desperation in his friend's eyes. Anton cried harder. He didn't blame Tate, not for a second. If that had been Lena and Leo in the hands of the Russian, Anton would have sung like a bird. Little good it had done. Mr. and Mrs. Craig were dead. The memory of Mrs. Craig's pumpkin bread flooded his mouth. Even though his mouth was full of blood, Anton could taste it clearly. His sobs increased. As Anton knelt on the cold, unyielding concrete of the cell, he felt a part of himself shrivel up and die on the floor with the Craig family. He sensed it was the most precious part of himself that died. It was the little kid that had snuck up on Lena and sprayed her in the back with the hose. It was the boy who had pounded on the bedroom door during the sleepover, demanding to be part of everything the older boys were doing. It was the teenage varsity football player who chased after pretty girls and snuck out to drink beer with his friends in the orchard after games. Gone. All gone. He was too weak to hold on to them. It was like those pieces of Anton had been stolen and now belonged to someone else. He wasn't sure how much longer he would live, but he knew he would never be the same. For the first time since being captured and tortured, Anton wanted to die. It was a true and singular desire. He wanted to join the Craigs and become nothing more than a memory. It had to be better than feeling like a stranger in his own body. Sobs continued to rack his body. He cried for the Craigs, for his father, and his lost friends. He cried for his ravaged country. Hell, he even cried for his mom. Some time later, amidst the screams and gunshots that continued to escalate outside of the jail cell, Anton passed out on the floor beside the bloody, beaten bodies of his friends. Chapter 12. Doctor. The sound of keys rattling in the cell door disturbed his slumber. The Anton Cecchino who awoke was different from the Anton Cecchino who had passed out beside the bodies of his friends. As he bolted upright, he distantly realized he could no longer feel the grief that had gripped him earlier. It was gone, ground to dust, and obliterated. Even though his body screamed in protest, Anton rolled into a crouch, ready to spring at the first fucker who walked through the door. He was ready to fight, to kill, to exact vengeance for all that had been done. A face peered in at him through the bars in the door. It was a big man with rumpled hair that was more white than brown. He didn't wear a Soviet uniform. A dirty white lab coat hung from thick shoulders. He stared at Anton, eyes wide. "You are sniper?" The English was thickly accented. Anton just stared at him, fists bunching. He didn't know who this fucker was, but it was clear he was a Russian. Therefore, he had to die. "I, doctor," the man said. "I need sanctuary. I make Nijit vaccine." The words stabbed into Anton's brain, attempting to penetrate the haze that demanded blood and vengeance. "I help you escape. You give me sanctuary. I help. I help American scientists." The man threw a nervous glance over one shoulder, looking in the direction of distant machine gun fire. "We must hurry. We help each other?" Help? Help a Russian scumbag? He'd sooner cut his own throat. The man must have seen this in Anton's eyes. "I help American scientists," he said. "Nijit vaccine. I help. I make vaccine." The words finally made it through. Anton felt them enter his body. "Nijit vaccine?" His words were rough, dragged from his parched throat by willpower alone. "Da, yes." The man nodded his head vigorously. "Dr. Kozlovovich, my name. I make Nijit vaccine." Vaccine. Anton remembered the Russians had a vaccine. It's the reason they could walk among zombies without fear of being bitten. "We must go now. Yes?" The man nodded eagerly, studying Anton's face. "Nijit vaccine?" Was this guy fucking with him? Was this the KGB agent's idea of a sick joke? "Vaccine. Yes, I make. I give to the American scientists. But first, you help me." The world spun around Anton. He was hyper-aware of the dead Craig family. He ground his teeth, trying to focus on the man. The sound of gunfire made him twitch. There was still shooting outside the jail. "What's going on outside?" he asked. Dr. Kozlovovich shook his head. "Very bad. No one listen to me. We must go.
Hurry, yes?
He turned the key in the lock. The cell door swung open. A mere 6 feet separated Anton from the bulky Russian scientist. It looked like the guy hadn't changed his clothes in weeks. His white lab coat was covered with dingy brown stains. Anton held himself back. He wanted to tear this man to pieces with his bare hands. The desire nearly overpowered him. He clung to sanity with a fingernail. Nejet vaccine. This man knew about it. He could help America if Anton could keep himself from killing him. His chest heaved with the effort. In his hand, Dr. Kozlovovich held a Soviet fatigue shirt. He extended his arm, holding it out to Anton.
Disguise, he said. Hurry.
Anton refused to touch the shirt. No fucking way. No fucking way would a Soviet uniform ever touch his skin again. A dull throb on the right side of his chest caught his attention. It was faint in comparison to the rest of his aches and pains, but it arrested Anton's attention. He ran his fingers over the lumpy scabs that had formed over the Soviet sigil that had been carved into his skin. Rage beat within him. He attempted to stride from the cell. His legs nearly collapsed. Dr. Kozlovovich caught him in the doorway. Anton noted the handle of a pistol sticking out from the man's lab coat jacket.
You wear uniform,
Kozlovovich said. No. The man grunted in annoyance, but he dropped the shirt to the ground and adjusted his grip on Anton.
We go. Hurry.
Anton had one last dizzying look back into the prison cell. His mind took a snapshot of the dead Craig family. Distantly, he knew the sight should cause him pain. All he felt was rage. Soviet fuckers needed to die for this.
Come, hurry.
Dr. Kozlovovich tugged him away from the open doorway. The Craigs disappeared forever as Anton allowed himself to be led along. He was limping on his left side. No, that wasn't accurate. He was limping on his left and right side. Each step sent pain lancing through him. The rage burning inside him made it easy to ignore. Anton wasn't quite as tall as Leo, but he wasn't small by any means. Dr. Kozlovovich was a huge man, taller than Anton by at least 2 inches. He was built like a bear with massive shoulders. And there was that gun in his pocket. The guy didn't look like a scientist. He looked like a tank. Was he fucking with Anton? Was this a fucked KGB trap? Anton snatched the pistol out of the guy's jacket and jerked himself away. He pressed his back against the corridor wall to keep himself from collapsing.
Who the fuck are you?
He snarled.
Did that KGB fuckhead send you?
Kozlovovich held up his hands.
I scientist. Nejet vaccine. You help me, I help you. Don't shoot, okay?
Where is that fucker? Anton screamed. He wanted the KGB agent. He wanted to kill him with his bare hands. Kozlovovich's eyes were full of understanding.
I showed you. Come.
He turned his back on Anton and strode away. If he was worried Anton would shoot him, he didn't let it show. Anton limped after him, gripping the pistol like a lifeline. He would shoot himself in the face before he let himself be taken again. No fucking way would another Soviet scumbag lay a finger on him. Chapter 13. Tank. "What's your plan for getting out of here?" Anton asked.
Think.
Kozlovovich paused, waiting for Anton to catch up.
A tank?
Yes. There must be a translation issue. Anton dropped the subject. The guy clearly had a plan for getting out of here. Anton didn't care if all the guy had was a pair of pogo sticks. He'd use whatever means of travel he could get his hands on. The screaming outside escalated. So did the gunfire. Anton hunched his shoulders and looked back down the corridor to make sure no one followed them. Nothing but bad memories looked back at him. They reached the end of the cell block. Kozlovovich pulled out a set of keys. "Where did you get those?" Anton asked.
Igor Bubovich.
Whatever the fuck that meant. Kozlovovich hesitated as he inserted the key into the lock. He gestured to the gun Anton carried.
You shoot. Many infected.
Infected? Fuck. He should have guessed. There must be a shit pile of mutants out there raising holy hell. The screams and gunfire finally made sense. "I'll shoot any infected that tries to fuck with us." And any Russian he laid eyes on, but Anton didn't mention that. Kozlovovich pulled open the door to the cell block. He and Anton peered out into the hall beyond. Anton felt like he was stepping through a time machine. He exited the hell of the prison block and entered a very normal-looking hallway with white-painted walls and linoleum floors. There was a drinking fountain a few feet to his left. Cork boards were stuck to the wall. Russian flags had been tacked to the boards. Fluorescent lights blared down on them. Besides the invader flag stuck to the corkboard, everything looked normal. Well, almost normal. There were the 2 dead Russians on the floor that sort of ruined the illusion. Then again, Anton rather liked the sight of the dead Soviets. There had been a time not so long ago when the sight of bodies had turned his stomach. He'd covered it up, of course. There was no sense in being a sissy about it. This was war, after all. But now, seeing the dead was almost as pleasurable as watching a movie. Anton distantly knew this fresh perspective wasn't entirely healthy, but he didn't give a shit. It was easier this way. He needed something to be fucking easy. The 2 Russians had been killed by vicious blows to the head. As Anton limped past them, staying on the heels of Kozlovovich, he saw their brains had been eaten. Yep, definitely the work of mutants. Only mutant zombies ate brains. He thought back to the 2 soldiers who had eaten the brains of Tate and Mrs. Craig. Those guys must have been bitten by mutants out on the field. It was the only explanation. Unless they were just sick fuckers. It was a toss-up, Anton decided. They drew abreast of the bodies. Anton got a good look at their faces. One was a regular soldier. The bastard who had nearly drowned him in that fucking bucket, Anton realized. The other body belonged to the KGB agent. Anton had a visceral reaction to the sight. Rage filled him. Even though the side of the man's head was caved in, Anton aimed the pistol. He never wanted to see the face of that sick fucker ever again. In the back of his mind, he knew nothing could ever erase the memory of his tormentor, but he sure as fuck was going to give it a good old-fashioned try. Gripping the weapon, he slammed the butt down into the agent's face. He smashed the dead man's cheekbone. It felt good. Anton brought the gun down a second time, hitting so hard he felt the tooth give way. He kept hitting, over and over again, pounding the hated agent's face to a mashy pulp. He felt like an animal. He didn't care. He didn't stop until the agent's face was eradicated and unrecognizable. Anton's chest heaved with emotion that threatened to burn him from the inside out. When he looked down at the wreckage he'd made, all he could see was the burning end of a cigarette. The scent of the smoke nearly choked him, even though there wasn't a cigarette anywhere in sight. Kozlovovich looked down at him with open sympathy. That made Anton almost as enraged as at the sight of the agent's dead body. "Don't look at me like that!" Kozlovovich held up his hands and took a few steps back, putting a healthy amount of space between himself and Anton. "Egopovovich!" He pointed to the dead agent. "Egopovovich! Keys!" Up until now, Anton hadn't known who the fucker was. He was a nameless, relentless demon who showed up at regular intervals to make his life a living hell. Having a name to go with his tormentor turned his stomach. He put his free hand against the wall and vomited up bile. Agapovovich. The name was like a chorus to a bad song. Anton wished he could unhear it. He wished he could erase the name from his memory, along with his face and the smell of cigarette smoke. The stutter of machine gun fire shook him out of his stupor. He spat on top of the body to clear his mouth, then pivoted on his bare feet. "Let's get the fuck out of here." He marched down the hall with Kozlovovich trailing beside him. The scientist had a new gun in his hands. He must have taken it from one of the bodies. "This way." Kozlovovich led him through a series of intersecting corridors. They passed another two bodies on the way. They had been shot to death, their brains still intact. Kozlovovich took him to a small loading dock where the jail received all its deliveries. The roll-up door was down, but Anton heard screaming and gunfire just on the other side. Kozlovovich approached the roll-up door. The man knew how to handle a gun. Anton could see that much. "Do they teach scientists how to use guns in Russia?" Kozlovovich didn't take his eyes away from the roll-up door. "I'm not always scientist. I was first a soldier." He seemed to think it was a solid explanation. It sounded fishy to Anton. Since when did science nerds learn how to use guns? His mind flashed back to just a few days ago when he and Leo had taken Jennifer, Cassie, and Amanda out into the woods to learn how to shoot. Cassie and Amanda were as nerdy as they came. Maybe the guy's story was solid. For the moment, Anton decided to continue trusting him. He could always kill him later. Next to the roll-up was a solid metal door. There was no window in it, no way to see what was going on outside. Kozlovovich pointed to the metal door and whispered, "Outside is tank." The screaming stopped. So did the gunshots. The two men looked at each other. Kozlovovich held up 3 fingers. Anton nodded in understanding, adjusting his grip so he could hold his gun with 2 hands. Kozlovovich lowered his fingers, counting down. 3, 2, 1. He jerked open the door. Anton went through first, gun raised. What he saw froze his feet in place. On the ground were 4 dead bodies. That wasn't the disturbing part. What shocked Anton was the sight of 2 living Russians, both of them crouched over the dead like it was Thanksgiving. They feasted on the brains, scooping up great handfuls and cramming them into their mouths. They looked up as Anton stepped onto the loading dock. Their eyes had gone completely red. Their hands and face were covered in gore. The Soviets were fast. One second, they were crouched over their holiday meal. In the next, they rushed Anton. "Shoot!" Kozlovovich cried, shouldering past him. "Shoot!" Bullets leaped from his gun. He aimed for the head, taking down the first of the assailants. Anton shook himself from his stupor and fired, but his aim was off. The bullets hit the second oncoming Russian in the chest and shoulder. The bullets barely slowed the guy. The infected Russian was nearly on Anton when Kozlovovich stepped in front of him and fired. Once again, he went for the head. The Soviet fell only a few inches from Kozlovovich's boots. "What the fuck?" Anton demanded. "What the hell is going on?"
"Nezhit vaccine."
Kozlovovich gave him a shove.
"Explain later. We must go. Tank."
That's when Anton saw the tank. An actual tank sitting right next to the loading dock. With his attention on the infected Russians and their snacks, he hadn't even noticed the gigantic olive-green tank sitting right out in the open. It hadn't been a translation issue. It was an American tank. The serial number on the side had been covered with red spray paint. Someone had decorated the side of the tank with Russia's star, sickle, and hammer. They had to move through the bodies to get to the tank. Kozlovovich scooped up weapons as he went. Anton joined him, collecting 3 machine guns and half a dozen magazines. The weight of the weapons felt good around his shoulders. "Where the hell did you get this thing?" Anton asked, as he and Kozlovovich climbed up the side of the tank.
"I told you. I take keys from Agapovovich."
Agapovovich, that fucking name again. Just hearing it brought back the smell of cigarette smoke. Anton gritted his teeth and climbed the rest of the way onto the tank. They were in an alleyway at the back of the jail. "You know how to drive this thing?"
"Yes, I drive. You take gun."
The bulky scientist gestured to the machine gun mounted on the top of the tank right next to the hatch. "Best fucking idea I've heard all day," Anton muttered. Kozlovovich disappeared down the hatch. Anton braced his bare feet on the ladder that led into the tank and gripped the gun. It was just past sunrise. The eastern sky was a soft pastel yellow. The tank lurched forward, rolling toward the mouth of the alleyway. Anton swung his gaze left, right, up and down, keeping an eye out for enemies. Chapter 14. Outbound. The Soviet compound had dissolved into mayhem. Anton could hardly believe what he was seeing. What he had assumed was a full-scale mutant attack was, in fact, a full-scale insurrection by infected Soviets. They didn't look like regular zombies. They didn't look like mutants either. They were something else, Anton realized. They moved too fast to be regular humans and were hard to kill. A direct shot to the head was the only way to effectively stop them. Brains were their drug of choice, and they had all red demon eyes. As Kozlovovich drove the tank out into the open, it hit Anton. The scientist had tried to tell him earlier. "Nezhit vaccine," he had said. The Nezhit vaccine was making a bunch of these guys sick. To be precise, it was turning them into homicidal brain eaters. They rampaged through the Soviet compound, attacking former comrades and killing them. It was a bloodbath. Feasting infected and dead soldiers were everywhere. In a nearby storefront, he spotted half a dozen Russians in a shootout with a group of infected. To his sick horror, he saw the infected using guns just like regular Soviets. Shit! That meant the infected Soviets were intelligent. This was bad, very, very bad. Based on this observation, Anton was liberal with the machine gun turret. He shot anyone who got within 20 feet of the tank. He shot anyone else within range, too. And he took out regular Soviets just for good measure. Killing anything and everything that moved seemed like the best plan. Kozlovovich was no less ruthless. He shifted the tank into high gear and rolled straight through anything that got in their way. He drove over bodies, living and dead. All the while, he kept the tank moving toward the compound. Anton caught sight of the building he and Tate had stood on together just a short while ago. How long ago had that been? Time had ceased to exist in that hellhole. He had no idea how long he had been down there. He felt like he'd aged 50 years. Something moved in his periphery. He swung the gun around and spotted several infected prowling along the edge of the roof just ahead of them. They were no doubt planning to jump on the tank. Well, fuck that. That wasn't happening on Anton's watch. He raked the air with gunfire, watching in satisfaction when several of them toppled to the ground below. The others died on the rooftop. A boom echoed through the air. A vibration ran through the metal bones of the tank. Anton's heart rate spiked. He swung around in alarm, searching for the threat. A split second later, he realized Kozlovovich had fired the tank's cannon. His target was a melee in the middle of the road. A knot of 20 or more Soviets battled infected. They were all that stood between them and the portable, chain-link fencing that marked the official perimeter of the Soviet compound. Kozlovovich's aim was good. His missile hit the edge of the group. Bodies sprayed into the air. Anton laid down additional fire, loosing the fury of the machine gun on the melee. A bellow tore itself from his throat. He screamed for Tate. He screamed for Mr. and Mrs. Craig. He screamed for his dad, and Lars, and Adam, and Jim, and every other poor bastard who had suffered and died in this war. One of the Soviets fell back into the protective alcove of a storefront. The tip of a machine gun poked around the corner and sprayed bullets in his direction. They pinged off the tank around him. Anton dropped into the belly of the tank. Rage scoured his bones. The Soviets had done enough to him. No more. He wasn't going to die. Not today. He secured the hatch. There were several slot visors around the vehicle. Anton scurried over to one and poked a machine gun into the opening. As soon as the soldier came into view, Anton laid into the trigger. As soon as he finished off that soldier, he shifted his attention to the few others he saw through the slot visor and opened fire.
"We through!"
Kozlovovich's voice rumbled over the rattle of the machine gun fire.
"We through fence!"
Anton scrambled back up the hatch and threw it open. When he popped out, he had a perfect view of the bloodbath he and Kozlovovich had left behind them. Broken bodies soaked the street with gore. The violence soothed the deep part of him. He wanted more. Anton stayed where he was, alert and watchful. He shot anything that moved. A few mutants fell to his gun. He even managed to get a few more Soviets. Watching them die was like applying ice to a wound. He craved more of it. But the further they got from downtown, the more apparent it became that there was no one left to kill. Rossi was a dead city. There was no one here.
"Directions,"
Kozlovovich called up to him.
"Where I go?"
"Freeway on-ramp, dead ahead, head west." Anton stayed where he was. If there was even a remote chance of killing another Soviet, he wasn't going to risk losing out. They rolled out of town. The tank nudged aside any cars that blocked their path, moving them aside like they were nothing more than matchsticks. Anton decided he liked having a tank. It might not be as fast as a car, but it was practically indestructible. We took out a supply truck outside of Bastapol, Anton said. We need to stop and load up on food.
Is a good idea,
Kaz called back. As he was carried away from the town of Rossi, Anton felt the weight of his wounds rush back to him. He hurt all over. He was exhausted. Hell, only sheer willpower kept him from collapsing into the tank and falling asleep for the next 1,000 years. He glanced down at the dried blood that crackled across his skin. The star and sickle made dark, lumpy scabs. The puckered red skin around the wound stood out like an infection. That fucker hadn't even been able to draw a straight line. It looked like Anton had been carved on by a kindergartner. Remembered pain spidered through his chest. It was like the knife was still in him. Cold sweat broke out along his back as the stench of cigarette smoke hit him, even though the air around him was clear and cool. It was a beautiful morning in West County, California. He was free, but Anton still felt the cold floor of the prison cell. He still smelled the stench of dried urine. The taste of fear was sour in his mouth. His heart raced. He could hardly breathe. Dropping into the tank, he crouched on the floor, struggling to get himself under control. He couldn't afford to freak the fuck out. Not now. Not ever. Even if he did feel like he was coming apart at the seams. He owed it to Tate. He owed it to the entire Craig family. He had to hold his shit together, if only so he could avenge their deaths. He had to be tougher than death itself. Anton made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't stop until every last invader was driven from American soil. He would fight until his home was free, or he was dead. His heart rate slowed to normal. He realized his ribcage hurt like a motherfucker. Did he have cracked ribs? Possibly. The cigarette burns across his jaw, neck, chest, and torso itched. The skin was tender and blistered around the wounds. He was so fucking tired. Kozlovovich watched Anton in knowing silence from the tank's driver's seat.
They killed my wife,
he said when Anton met his gaze.
They killed my son. They are scum.
Anton digested this. He could tell by the look in the other man's eyes that he wasn't bullshitting him. Maybe he and Kozlovovich weren't so different. "Can I call you Koz?" he asked the massive Russian. Even Leo would look small next to this guy.
Yes, Koz is good. What I call you?
I'm Anton.
Sniper Anton. Nice to meet you.
He pointed back in the direction of Rossi.
The new infected. They are sentient.
Sentient, yeah. I noticed. The vaccine turned them?
Yes. I warned them. No one listened.
Why did you try to warn them if they killed your family? Koz's eyes hardened.
They kill my family when I try to warn them.
Oh. It was too much for Anton to process. He changed the subject. Where did you learn English? Koz shifted in his chair.
I am from merchant family. My father got me good education. I very smart. Always had top grades. I was conscripted as teenage boy to assist in virus research. There was a prison at the lab where I worked. That's where I trained with guns.
Anton grimaced, reading between the lines. Koz was admitting to working at a place that tested on human subjects.
I stole bread for prisoners who spoke English. They teach me English. It's good, no?
It's good. Anton did his best to banish thoughts of human test subjects in a lab that developed a zombie virus. That had to have been a hellhole much worse than the one from which he'd escaped. My friend gave up the location of the sniper base, Anton said. Do you think my people are in danger?
Assume the worst, Kals replied. That is always best plan.
Fuck. The man was right. Just because one half of the Soviets was busy eating the other half didn't mean the snipers were safe. That was the best-case scenario, but only an idiot banked on a best-case scenario. He and Tate had learned that the hard way. His family had received a brief stay of execution. With any luck, it would be long enough to clear everyone out of the family cabin and get them to someplace safe. Surely by now, Luma Bridge was gone. Leo and his team had to be home. Anton couldn't afford to consider any other option. Leo would be waiting for him at the cabin. They would pack up and get everyone to safety. Anton clung to this thought as the tank rolled west along the freeway, carrying him back to his home. Everyone would be okay. Leo, Lena, Dal, Nona, Bruce, Stevenson, Amanda, Cassie, Jennifer, Spill, Griggs. Everyone would be okay. Everyone except him. Anton knew he wasn't going to be okay for a long time. The blisters, cuts, bruises, abrasions, and burn marks on the outside of his body didn't even begin to scratch the surface. Part 2, 15 Miles. Chapter 15, Plan. The Chiquino cabin felt empty without Cassie. She and Amanda had been best friends since freshman year in high school. They did everything together, studied together, panicked over PE tests together, ate lunch at school together, and competed in chess tournaments together. The world had gone into the crapper. They were in the middle of a war and a zombie apocalypse combined. Both of Amanda's parents had been killed. Through it all, Cassie had been there. Every single day. Amanda hadn't realized how much it would hurt to see her best friend disappear down the road from Pole Mountain on a bike with her hot boyfriend. Or how lonely she would feel without her. The idea of Cassie going off to blow up a bridge in enemy territory was a chess game Amanda did not want to play, let alone think about. She wished she had gone with them. When Leo asked for mission volunteers, she'd wanted to raise her hand. But what could she add to a group of trained soldiers, varsity football players, and an ex-gymnast? Heck, Cassie didn't even fit so well within the group, except that she could outthink all of them combined. And if Cassie barely fit, Amanda knew she stood no chance. She was acutely aware of her lack of athletic abilities. She was from a big-boned family. No one ever wanted the big girl on their team. Ever since she'd been a kid, she was always the last one picked for PE teams. It had been even worse in high school, where looks mattered more than ever. Mrs. Fink, their PE teacher who competed in triathlons on the weekend, had taken one look at Amanda on her first day of freshman PE. From that day, she'd been sentenced to right field in both the literal and the figurative sense. She might not be into sports, but everyone knew right field was reserved for the useless players. Amanda had known better than to volunteer for the mission to Luma. It just would have made everyone uncomfortable. Leo would have been forced to figure out a way to let her down gently. He had enough worries on his mind. He didn't need to be bothered with her. So Amanda had kept her hand down and now regretted it. That regret piled even higher on her shoulders with every minute that passed without Cassie. She did her best not to think about it. On the bright side, it wasn't like she had a lot of spare time on her hands. She, Lena, and Dal were scheduled to go on another broadcast mission bright and early tomorrow morning. They had important information to share. There were several buses of Soviet invaders on their way to West County. If Cassie and the others didn't get to the bridge in time, a new wave of invaders would hit their home. The few survivors out there needed to know what was happening. Dal and Lena never looked at her the way Mrs. Fink did. They treated her like a valuable member of the team. She tried not to bask in their kindness or look too desperate for their approval. Amanda had a side project she'd been stewing on for several days now. When Nona went to use the bathroom, she slipped into the kitchen and swiped a Ziploc from a drawer. Ziplocs were a prized commodity these days, and she didn't think Nona would approve of her taking one. "What are you doing?" Stevenson frowned at her from where he washed dishes. In a drastic effort to avoid participating in missions, Stevenson had thrown himself into the kitchen work with gusto. He was often up early and late, prepping food or cleaning up. Tonight was no exception. He was up to his elbows in suds as he scrubbed a big pot. "What are you doing?" he asked again, as she shoved the Ziploc into her back pocket. "I keep thinking about the zombies." Amanda absently fiddled with the hilt of her hunting knife, a gift from the Cecchino family. Most days, she tried to pretend it belonged on her belt, though she secretly worried about slicing off her finger with the darn thing. "We need to get a good look at the bodies." A look of horror overcame Stevenson's face. He stopped mid-scrub, soap bubbles popping delicately around his elbows. "Are you even listening to yourself? You're being disgusting." "Please," Amanda snorted. "I mean, we need a scientific look at them." She scooted closer to Stevenson so Dal and Lena wouldn't overhear. The two of them sat on the couch, snuggled into each other and talking quietly. "Who knows what we might learn if we can get a piece of one of them under a microscope?" Stevenson gave her a soft look. "I know you miss Cass. I miss her already, too. But I think you're being a little extreme with this carve up a dead zombie plan." "I don't want to carve up a zombie. I just want to get a tissue sample. Sometimes we see bodies when we go out for a broadcast. Sometimes they saw live zombies, too. I might get a chance to get a sample tomorrow." Stevenson resumed his scrubbing. "The Cecchinos have a lot of stuff in their basement, but the last time I checked, there weren't any microscopes." "I know." Amanda had been mentally working on this minor setback. "But I have an idea." "An idea, huh? Do I want to hear it?" "Duh. Of course you do. You're going to have to dry dishes if you're going to take up space in Nona's kitchen." "Okay." Amanda grabbed a towel from a drawer and began drying silverware. "The way I figure it, there's eventually going to be another mission to Bastopol. When that happens, I just have to convince them to make a detour to the science lab at the high school. Remember all those great microscopes Mr. Dillon got last year?" "You're crazy." Stevenson heaved the huge pot out of the sink and plucked it down on the counter. "First of all, you have no idea when anyone is going back to Bastopol. Second of all, no one is going to risk their life to get you a microscope." "Mr. Dillon's microscopes were top of the line. He wrote a grant to get them." "The science lab is probably a pile of dust," Stevenson said. "In case you forgot, Leo and the others blew up half the high school. Their attack was by the football field. The science lab's on the other side of the school. Why get zombie samples now anyway? Shouldn't you wait until you actually have a microscope? I mean, where do you plan to store it? In the freezer. You think Nona is going to let you store a piece of zombie in her freezer? Stevenson's eyebrows nearly climbed off his forehead. Good luck with that. Amanda opened her mouth to retort, but Nona returned from the bathroom. Amanda continued to dry dishes so she wouldn't look suspicious. You have a big day ahead of you tomorrow. Nona gave Amanda an affectionate pat on the cheek. You should get some sleep. Stevenson and I will finish up. That's okay. I can help. Amanda didn't really want to go to bed. She and Cassie shared a bunk. Climbing into bed would be a reminder that her friend was out there on a dangerous mission, risking her life for their country. Chapter 16. Mrs. Fink. Amanda. Lena touched her on the arm. It's time to go. Meet you outside. Make sure you grab a machine gun. She gave Amanda a kind smile before heading out the door. Amanda patted her back pocket to make sure the Ziploc was still there. The plastic crinkled under her fingers. She paused on her way out, surveying the rack of various weapons just inside the door. It was still hard to reconcile herself to lugging around a machine gun. She felt like an imposter. Lena and the others were badasses. She was just a nerdy girl who sucked at gym class and geeked out in biology class. She tried to feel like she belonged to this group of guerrilla soldiers who had made it their mission to fight the zombies and Russian invaders. Cassie had proven chess nerds could be part of this group. For starters, she had managed to snag Leo Cecchino. Amanda found that fact even more startling than the fact they both carried around machine guns. Chess nerds weren't supposed to nab former high school quarterbacks. No one wrote love stories about that. Amanda was a closet expert when it came to love stories. She used to steal romance books from her mom's pile and read them at night after her parents went to bed. Leo might look like the guys on the cover of those books, but there were no women in those pages who were like Cassie. Which was why her friend inspired her so much. If Cassie could ride off on a mission with her hunky boyfriend, it meant Amanda's preconceived reality could be altered. It meant she, Amanda Nielsen, could be a guerrilla. It meant she could wield a gun and fight for her country. It also meant she could figure out a way to get a tissue sample from a zombie, preferably from a regular zombie and a mutant. She just had to get Dal and Lena to buy off on the idea. Grabbing a machine gun, she slung it around her shoulder before grabbing an extra magazine. Then she headed outside to where Dal and Lena waited for her in the broadcast truck. The old brown pickup had belonged to Mr. Cecchino. Stevenson had helped them rig the broadcasting antenna and the transmitter to the engine. Amanda liked to think of it as a mobile guerrilla news station. Lena and Dal, always together, sat in the cab. It would have been a tight fit for all three of them with the transmitter, especially with Amanda coming from a big-boned family. She climbed into the back like she always did when she went out with them. Amanda, Stevenson waved at her from the porch. Be safe. He gave her a meaningful look as Nona came out to stand beside him. The two of them waved goodbye as Dal drove away. Where are we headed to today? Amanda asked through the open cab window. Lena held up a map. We're heading northeast. She pointed to a spot on the map. There's a good peak about 15 miles from the cabin. Do you know the owner of the land? On one of their missions, they'd been forced to face off with a zombified landowner. It's the boundary of Armstrong Woods. Amanda frowned in concern. We're not going to be close to any of the campgrounds, are we? Most of the zombies from the first wave of the invasion had died off by now, but there were still mutants out there. We'll be miles from the nearest campground, Dal replied. Amanda took the map Lena held out to her, absorbing the tight row of topographic lines between them and their destination. They were in for a long ride. Dal and Lena always picked remote locations for the broadcasts. There were often no legitimate roads, which meant the old truck had to roll along at a very sedate pace if they didn't want to break an axle. That was okay. Amanda didn't mind. The scenery was always nice, and it felt good to be doing something. She handed the map back to Lena and Dal and did her best to get comfortable in the metal truck bed. Officially, she was on watch. It was always a good way to pass the time. The truck bumped along, rolling through open grassland. They passed stands of oak and bay trees. Amanda recognized the dry stream bed that marked the edge of the Chiquino property. Where was Cassie now? It had been hard to sleep last night, knowing her best friend was out there on a mission. It had taken a concerted effort not to obsess over all the terrible things that could happen to her. It was weird to think that, only a few weeks ago, her biggest concern in life had been getting an A in PE. 2 quarters of B minuses in her junior year of physical education had tanked her GPA. Technically, she'd still had a 4.0 because of her honor classes, but Stanford, UC Berkeley, and Cal Poly weren't interested in 4.0 students. Amidst nightmares of getting stranded at junior college due to her abysmal PE grades, Amanda's mom made a New Year's resolution to lose weight. She bought a stack of Jane Fonda videos, some hand weights, and an aerobic step. After a month of dedicated exercise, her mom went down an entire pant size. That had been enough evidence for Amanda. If she could get herself in shape, maybe she could squeak out an A- in PE. She threw herself into the workouts the same way she threw herself into learning Spanish, biology, and trigonometry, with 100% commitment. By the time the 3rd quarter of her junior year rolled around, she pulled out a solid A in PE. This had been a particularly epic feat because that had been the quarter of the timed mile. Amanda had knocked out a 9-minute mile, which had been enough to tip her grade from a B+ to an A. Ever since then, Amanda had dedicated herself to her workouts. Her mom had faded off after a few months, but Amanda had Stanford, Cal Poly, and UC Berkeley in her sights. Would she let up on chemistry studies? No way. And no way was she going to let a mediocre PE grade stand between her and her dreams. Amanda liked weight training the best. She'd been surprised to realize she was actually pretty strong. Maybe big muscles came with being big-boned? She wasn't sure. But she could knock out reps with the 10-pound weights and barely break a sweat. She never told anyone about her workouts, not even Cassie. She knew she didn't look like the popular girls at school. They actually managed to look pretty even with sweat-smeared makeup and unperfect hair. Amanda knew what it looked like when a big-boned girl hopped up and down on an aerobic step. There was nothing pretty about it. So, she kept her workouts a secret. When Cassie and Stevenson congratulated her on pulling out an A in PE, she downplayed it so they wouldn't ask too many questions. When they'd been rescued by Dal and Leo at the beginning of the invasion, Amanda had been forced to ride a bike all the way from her house to the Chiquino cabin. Most of the way had been on dirt trails with lots of rolling hills. She smiled to herself and remembered pride. No one had commented on the fact that she had no problem keeping up. Everyone had been worried that Stevenson might have a heart attack. Amanda had known it was her studious application of Jane Fonda videos that had given her the needed endurance for the feat. No one really knew how much work went into the good grades kids like her got in school. Most kids assumed it was natural mental talent. But the truth was that those straight A's were backed with a lot of effort and dedication. P.E. was no exception. The truck rolled to a stop. They were on yet another hilltop in the middle of nowhere. Stands of redwood trees were now sprinkled in throughout the bay and oak trees, a clear sign they had entered Armstrong Woods. The state park was a local favorite for old-growth redwoods. Amanda picked up the antenna from the back of the truck. Stevenson had rigged a PVC pipe with some duct tape to the back of the truck's cab. That's where the antenna was mounted during broadcasts. Amanda had just settled the antenna into the PVC pipe when she saw something move in the trees. The tree line was 20 yards away down a steep hillside, leaving Amanda eye level with the taller parts of the trees. She paused, frowning at the trees. Something moved out there. Whatever it was, it jumped among the branches like a monkey. She tracked the movement by the ripple of leaves that moved from tree to tree. Her heart rate spiked as she caught sight of something. It was big and earth-colored. There was no way it could be an animal. There was no animal that big in North America that lived in trees. "Guys, there's something in the tree," she cut off in a scream as it materialized. It was a mutant zombie. He had a lean face, a bushy beard, and was dressed from head to toe in khaki. He'd probably been a granola backpacking dude before getting infected. He burst from the trees like a flying demon, coming straight for them.